National Electrical Code, or NEC, Section 110.26.A.2 addresses the working space requirements for electrical equipment. This section is crucial for ensuring the safety of personnel who may need to examine, adjust, service, or maintain electrical equipment while it is energized. The code mandates a minimum working space in front of electrical equipment. This working space must meet certain dimensions in terms of width, depth, and height. Let's focus on the width requirement, and that is specified as a minimum of 30 inches. The depth requirement depends on the voltage to ground and the condition of the installation as outlined in NEC Table 110.26.A.1. The height of the working space must be at least 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater, as stated in 110.26.A.3. Now consider the scenario of having two panel boards installed directly next to each other. To determine if this installation complies with 110.26.A.2, we must assess whether the combined installation meets the minimum working space width requirement. Let's say each panel board is 20 inches wide. The combined width of the two panel boards would be 40 inches. According to the NEC, the minimum working space width required is 30 inches. Since the combined width of the panel boards is 40 inches, this leaves 10 inches of working space available to the left of the left panel board and another 10 inches of working space available to the right of the right panel board. In this configuration, the working space is effectively distributed across the 40-inch span of the combined panel boards. It's crucial to understand that NEC 110.26.A.2 does not explicitly prohibit the overlapping of working spaces for adjacent equipment. The primary concern of the code is to ensure that sufficient working space is available to safely perform electrical work. As long as the minimum working space requirements are met, the code does not restrict the overlap of working spaces. In our example, where each panel board is 20 inches wide, the combined width of 40 inches exceeds the minimum required working space of 30 inches. Therefore, the installation complies with NEC 110.26.A.2, even if the working spaces of the two panel boards overlap. Now let's consider a scenario where the combined width of the two panel boards is less than 30 inches. In this case, the installation would not comply with NEC 110.26.A.2. For example, if each panel board were only 10 inches wide, the combined width would be 20 inches. This is less than the required 30-inch working space. In such a situation, modifications would be necessary to ensure compliance. This could involve increasing the spacing between the panel boards or relocating one of the panel boards to provide the necessary working space. Now let's delve deeper into the practical implications of these requirements. Firstly, it is important to understand the rationale behind the working space requirement. The purpose of these requirements is to provide electricians and other qualified personnel with enough room to safely perform their work. This includes tasks such as inspecting equipment, making repairs, and performing maintenance. Sufficient working space reduces the risk of electrical shock, arc flash, and other hazards. Secondly, it is important to consider the specific conditions of the installation. The depth of the working space required depends on the voltage to ground and the condition of the installation, as outlined in NEC Table 110.26.A.1. For example, if the equipment is operating at a higher voltage, a greater working depth is required. Similarly, if the installation involves exposed live parts on both sides of the working space, a greater working depth is required. Thirdly, it is important to ensure that the working space is clear and unobstructed. NEC 110.26.B requires that the working space be kept clear of obstructions that could impede access to the equipment. This includes items such as storage boxes, tools, and other materials. Obstructions can increase the risk of accidents and make it more difficult to perform electrical work safely. Fourthly, it is important to consider the lighting in the working space. NEC 110.26.D requires that the working space be adequately illuminated. This helps to improve visibility and reduce the risk of accidents. The specific lighting requirements depend on the type of work being performed and the ambient lighting conditions. Fifthly, it is important to ensure that the equipment is properly labeled. NEC 110.21 requires that electrical equipment be clearly labeled with its voltage, current, and other important information. This helps to prevent confusion and ensure that workers are aware of the potential hazards. Sixthly, it is important to follow proper lockout/tagout procedures before working on electrical equipment. Lockout/tagout procedures are designed to prevent accidental energization of equipment while it is being worked on. This helps to protect workers from electrical shock and other hazards. Seventhly, it is important to use appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE, when working on electrical equipment. PPE includes items such as safety glasses, gloves, and arc-rated clothing. PPE helps to protect workers from electrical shock, arc flash, and other hazards. Eighthly, it is important to be aware of the potential for arc flash. Arc flash is a dangerous electrical explosion that can occur when there is a fault in an electrical system. Arc flash can cause serious burns, blindness, and even death. It is important to take steps to prevent arc flash, such as using appropriate PPE and following proper safety procedures. Ninthly, it is important to be properly trained before working on electrical equipment. Electrical work can be dangerous, and it is important to have the knowledge and skills necessary to perform the work safely. Training should cover topics such as electrical safety, lockout/tagout procedures, and the use of PPE. Tenthly, it is important to consult with a qualified electrical contractor if you are unsure about any aspect of electrical work. A qualified electrical contractor can provide expert advice and ensure that the work is performed safely and in compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. To further elaborate on the NEC requirements, let's consider some additional scenarios. Imagine a situation where you have 3 panel boards installed next to each other. Each panel board is 15 inches wide. The combined width of the 3 panel boards is 45 inches. This exceeds the minimum required working space of 30 inches. In this case, the installation would comply with NEC 110.26.A.2. However, it is important to ensure that the working space is evenly distributed across the 45-inch span. There should be sufficient space to the left of the leftmost panel board and to the right of the rightmost panel board. Now consider a situation where you have 2 panel boards installed next to each other, but one of the panel boards is significantly wider than the other. For example, one panel board is 10 inches wide and the other panel board is 30 inches wide. The combined width of the 2 panel boards is 40 inches. This exceeds the minimum required working space of 30 inches. In this case, the installation would comply with NEC 110.26.A.2. However, it is important to ensure that the wider panel board does not obstruct access to the narrower panel board. The working space should be arranged in such a way that it is easy to access both panel boards for examination, adjustment, servicing, or maintenance. In addition to the width and depth requirements, NEC 110.26.A.3 also specifies a minimum height requirement for the working space. The height of the working space must be at least 6 feet 6 inches or the height of the equipment, whichever is greater. This ensures that there is enough headroom to safely perform electrical work. It is important to note that the height requirement applies to the entire working space, not just the area immediately in front of the equipment. The working space should be clear of any obstructions that could reduce the headroom. This includes items such as pipes, ducts, and other equipment. If there are any obstructions in a working space, they should be relocated or removed to ensure compliance with the height requirement. Let's delve into some more practical examples. Imagine a scenario where you are installing panel boards in a narrow hallway. The hallway is only 4 feet wide. In this situation, it may be difficult to meet the minimum working space requirements. You may need to consider using smaller panel boards or relocating the panel boards to a different location. It is important to carefully assess the available space and ensure that the installation complies with all applicable codes and regulations. Now consider a scenario where you are installing panel boards in a commercial building. The building has a high ceiling. In this situation, you may be able to install the panel boards at a higher level to provide more working space. However, it is important to ensure that the panel boards are still accessible for examination, adjustment, servicing, or maintenance. You may need to install a platform or ladder to provide access to the panel boards. The platform or ladder should be designed to safely support the weight of the workers and their equipment. It is also important to ensure that the platform or ladder is properly secured to prevent it from tipping or falling. Remember that safety should always be the top priority when working with electrical equipment. It is important to follow all applicable codes and regulations and to take all necessary precautions to protect yourself and others from electrical hazards. When installing panel boards, it is essential to carefully consider the working space requirements. The working space should be large enough to allow workers to safely perform their work. The working space should also be clear of any obstructions that could impede access to the equipment. By following these guidelines, you can help to ensure that your electrical installations are safe and compliant. Let's consider some additional factors that may affect the working space requirements. The type of equipment being installed can affect the amount of working space required. For example, some types of equipment may require more working space than others. The manufacturer's instructions should be consulted to determine the specific working space requirements for each piece of equipment. The location of the equipment can also affect the working space requirements. For example, equipment installed in a damp or wet location may require more working space than equipment installed in a dry location. This is because the increased risk of electrical shock in damp or wet locations necessitates greater clearance and accessibility. The presence of other equipment in the area can also affect the working space requirements. For example, if there is other equipment located near the panel boards, it may be necessary to increase the working space to provide adequate clearance. The working space should be large enough to allow workers to safely access and work on all of the equipment in the area. Finally, it is important to remember that the working space requirements are minimum requirements. In some cases, it may be necessary to provide more working space than is required by the code. This may be necessary to accommodate the specific needs of the installation or to improve worker safety. The decision of how much working space to provide should be based on a careful assessment of the risks involved and the needs of the workers who will be performing the work. Remember, proper planning and adherence to safety standards are crucial for safe and compliant electrical installation.